Fingers crossed it works this time. Do 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 do. All right, let's see if this action. Take two. Hopefully the only necessary extra take. Let's see. Da, 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 da. All right. Is it working? Yay. What's that? Do 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 do. Yeah da 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 da. That seems to be working. I've managed to not screw it up myself this time, so that's a good so far. Let's not get too crazy. Da, 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 da. Oh, wait a second. No, I want this. Let's see. All right. Da da dee dee dee. Good. I'm glad it's working so good. There may have been multiple issues yesterday too. I'm not exactly sure. I know I screwed up, but that may not have been the full picture. Because there were a bunch of speakers in that room that unaware if they're even on. I didn't see any lights or anything, but I'm gonna get started right at 11. All right, everything seems to be working. Ba, 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 ba. Gonna start in about 4 minutes. All right. Going ahead. Everything seems good. Audio seems to be working. And so this is, in a way, the official kickoff of my cork, my book slash course, a term my girlfriend coined a couple weeks back, called Why Are You Here? Beyond the Secret Gate. Now, originally this was going to be just a book in the same vein as The Secret Gate. It was going to be a direct sort of follow-on format, except I was going to frame the book like I did The Secret Gate. I used the framing device of Star Wars to talk in The Secret Gate, and in the follow-up I was going to use the movie Jaws to talk about Why Are You Here as a framing device. And that's still present because the book was written, but as the years went by in between the publishing of The Secret Gate and now, and I became more familiar with people trying to learn from that book or from some of the resources or things I pointed to, it did not seem to really have the effect. Now, the book, The Secret Gate, was mostly written with the idea in mind that I wanted to communicate the idea of armature, a term used in this sense, in this vernacular, by Brian McDonald, screenwriter and filmmaker. And I wanted to just communicate in The Secret Gate that this is an idea which is essentially the underlying structure of how you create meaning in something. And since then, I have found it in all sorts of drawing and painting, other arts, music. But most people nowadays don't seem to understand much about this. And that is another question for another day, perhaps. But the thing that really struck me after The Secret Gate came out was how sort of difficult it was, I guess, to learn armature, learn how to see armature. It seemed like a very arduous thing. Now, my personal experience, of course, was, as you know from The Secret Gate, was that I had been watching, for Lord knows how many years, I've been watching the original Star Wars movie on repeat. And in fact, I was doing some machine tool work, and I used to put on the Star Wars movies on my DVD player. I think it was back then. It might have even been VHS, because I had both, I think, still. I would put them as background music, and then when some of my favorite parts would come up, I would stop the bandsaw or the drill press, and I would watch these things and recite the lines. And it was just one particular day, after I'd seen this movie hundreds of times, I knew all the words inside and out, upside and down, backwards, that it jumped out at me. And that is an unusual experience. And when I look back on that now, because I was probably like 22 or 23 maybe? I can't remember what I said in the book, if I researched that down to the exact year or not. But basically, I had watched it so much, all the normal stuff, and knew it so well, that all the normal stuff sort of fell away because I was just on, autopilot, essentially. And then the unity of all the parts jumped out at me for the first time. So to say it came easy, I'd say would be wrong, because I literally had to watch it that many times. So that's like a form of work. Although I was doing it for pleasure, I watched it so many times, I made it almost like a job out of it. So, and it was one of those things where even I saw parts on TV, right? Or I had direct TV back then. I would, watch, if I saw it on TV or saw it listed, I would go to that channel and I would watch it. So the piecemeal watching of that original Star Wars, what they now call it A New Hope, probably is, 500 times. I don't know. But it's one of those things that really, because I knew it so well, eventually the hidden understructure revealed itself. Now, that is not the usual, as I have learned. That's not the usual way to, and of course, at the time, it's not the usual way things happen. And at the same time, I didn't have the word armature for it. I had no idea what that was even called. To me, it seemed very much like an exploded diagram. Because at the time, I was doing a lot of machining and stuff for my own business. And so I was in a very analytical mode. I had drawn blueprints and all this kind of stuff. So to me at the time, the closest thing I could relate to what sort of presented itself was an exploded diagram you get of some sort of machine. I'm sure you've seen this, is where all the parts are pulled apart in a diagram showing you how they all fit together at the same time and all the different parts. And that's kind of what it was like. I could see how the dialogue and the characters and the settings all related to what it was about, what the true story being told was. And at that point, I had no use for it. I had assumed that's just what great storytellers know. That's just what George Lucas knew. And I didn't really even bother to, make a big deal out of it or source out other things. It wasn't until I started street performing, of course, when I was 39. So more than 11, what was that, 12 years ago? 13 years ago, whatever it is. That I went back, that I was sort of unsatisfied with like my magic show, and like I was building a brand new show for the street. For the first 6 months to a year, I was really trying different things and really going crazy. And because you're doing so many shows a day, you can literally try all the things. But it still became very apparent very quickly that it didn't have the impact. It had the usual impact that a magic trick has, or a series of magic tricks. And in general, I'm good with people, so I would always get a pretty good reception from the audience anyways. But it had no lasting, outside of my own personality, the show itself had no lasting effect. So as the years went by since the Secret Gate, I have learned that it's been way more difficult for people to learn this than I first anticipated, because mine happened very organically. And then when I went back, when I was building my street show, and I went back to look at how Star Wars had done that, and then start to look around for other examples like the Shawshank Redemption or some of the other Star Wars movies, classic movies that I grew up in. And it seems very sort of apt, I guess, that I grew up primarily in the 80s and early 90s. In my childhood, I was born in 1974, so like the 80s were the bulk of my childhood, and that seems to be the last great generation of people who really knew how to tell a story. So I was growing up right as like the best storytellers, who even now are still the best storytellers, were like at the zenith basically of their careers. So I got very lucky that way. And so that DNA of that stuff was like almost in me anyways, without me really knowing it or understanding it, certainly. But since then, I have learned that it's much more difficult to see armature than I first suspected. And the person who has committed the most to this, or it's because it's been, almost 5 years since the Secret Gate came out, has been the editor, Chappie Green, my editor. Nate is his name. He was, present when I first introduced these ideas, and we would have conversations about this. He was very taken with the idea, of course, like a lot of people do get. And so he would go to the library, he'd rent some of these movies, he'd try to watch them. Now, he hasn't gone and studied it the way I did when I first sort of like decided I'm going to port this idea over to magic in my own show, because he's got other obligations. But over these last 5 years, I'd say consistently, he has dipped back in, dipped back out when he can, and he has made steady progress. And it has not come easy to him at all. And I would say if everyone probably who's going to watch this is in a similar place, because it is difficult. But in the first week of the cork, I explain why that's good. And I use an example actually in some of the resources and for the exercises I'm providing. I recently took a coding course through Stanford, and one of the first things they introduced us to was like this idea of it being tough, especially when you're trying to learn a new language, because that's essentially what you're doing with armature is you're trying to get a grip on a brand new language. You're seeing things with new eyes, and that's why people have so much trouble with it, I think, is they can't convert that without some real application. Like I couldn't just learn coding, learn Python. I was taking a Python class. I couldn't just learn those first 8 weeks of coding just by seeing somebody code once or even 50 times and then know it. No, I had to actually dig in. I had to do coding exercises. I had to, make a final project, blah, blah, blah. So this is what it requires. If you intend to become a real magician with a capital M, you will have to similarly apply yourself, just like I did, just like Brian did, just like Steven Spielberg did, I'm sure. Lucas, people in this coding project I was a part of. Anytime you're really trying to learn something, I started learning to teach myself to draw 2 years ago. I've drawn every day since, haven't missed a single day. Maybe spend half an hour to an hour a day drawing, and consistently got better as I've applied myself. And that's all we're talking about. And so what I saw was a bunch of people who had introduced this idea of armature, but not really on their own being able to apply themselves to consistent study. And as a result, they couldn't get it. And I had a recent encounter which really encapsulated probably the frustration people have with this. Because a friend of mine who's essentially known since, I talked about this I think in an email recently. I have a friend I've known probably since about 2014. And I first told him about armature. And the very first day that I told him about it, we ended up having like a pretty strong argument outside of a coffee shop. And he was very resistant to the idea that there is such a thing that he couldn't see. And then what that may have said about art, stuff I wrote in The Secret Gate eventually, how I don't think art is subjective, what this might mean for art. Because he very much had like this kind of, which I've encountered quite a bit, I would say, this kind of wooey, airy-fairy sort of notion of art. This like, as though it's almost divine or it's like in the air and it doesn't have a form. It doesn't have any sort of structure to it or anything. But that's complete bullshit. Because all good things do have a structure. Otherwise, as David Mamet points out in his book on directing film, a bunch of people tried to make architecture based on their feelings in the 60s, and those buildings fell down, fell over, couldn't sustain themselves. So much like a building that is standing, it has a structure, which is maybe not always readily apparent to the extent of the structure. And so all art, when I got into drawing, I learned very quickly, because I assumed it did already, that there's a very, there are unviolable structural components to drawing. And a lot of drawing has to do, like everything else, with seeing, being able to see things, being able to see forms, values, all these type of things. So it's no different, because when you're learning armature, you have to learn to get past what Brian calls the clothing. And this involves like genre, other things that are very nebulous and not real, unless you're a marketing person, unless you're involved in marketing your work. But what this does entail is you have to get past the surface level things. If it was a building, you have to get past the glass and the antennas and all, whatever, and see into the innards of the beams, the levers, does it have an elevator? How's the elevator get pulled up and down? These type of things. The things that aren't you can't see from the outside. And so the other aspect of it, and I'll get back to my friend, that friend who I had the initial argument with in a second. But the other aspect of it is it causes frustration. Anytime you're trying to learn something, I've been frustrated learning art, learning drawing. I'm now sort of dipping my toes into watercolor painting, which I've been sort of preparing for the last couple of years. The coding was frustrating in many ways, because I've never done, last time I tried to code something was probably 1986 with a Tandy computer from Radio Shack in Canada. So it leads people to be frustrated because they can't really immediately see it. And as I said earlier, that's a good sign. If you can't see it right away, chances are you are on the right track, because this is difficult to learn. It just is. And the further you go into it, I will say, the more is revealed. It's kind of like reading a book over and over again, or seeing a movie over and over again. You start to notice more details, and that leads to whole other things. Armature is like that. The more you learn about it, the more you see how grand of a connection all the things are that sort of entail it. And Brian's the only person really I have been able to find, without having the ability to talk to like a Steven Spielberg or a George Lucas or someone like this. Brian's the only person I've been able to find who actually understands this stuff. Like, and has written about it openly. There are other people working that obviously know this, because you can tell it from their work. When you analyze their work, you can see they know what they're doing and how they're designing their film. Rian Johnson is a good example, for example, famous for the Knives Out films and the Last Jedi, the Star Wars number 8 film. Yeah, he's really good at that. So he's learned that classically somehow, wherever he went to drama school or whatever, however it worked, film school. Somebody passed that idea along to him. A lot of the people who were like the sort of last brigade, the Lucases, the Spielbergs, John Milius, people like this, they were all sort of in the same friend group and all going through sort of the first film schools at the same time. So some of the people who were teaching them were longtime theater people, playwrights, people who'd done theater. And so usually a play, although it's suffered the same fate nowadays as movies, usually a play is is an armature. Is written to some sort of thematic statement. And so it pops up more readily there. But there's tons of famous playwrights who don't have a clue about that either. And that's one of the other things I'm going to try and communicate in this cork is like, there's a whole chapter about like how basically you're just like everybody else I've tried to read about as I was, which is like, most people just don't get this. Even like very famous people who are making movies and making a lot of money, they don't have a clue about this. And as a result, their work doesn't really work. The work doesn't work. Anyways, back to my friend. So that very first conversation I ever had with my friend led to an argument. And then he eventually started a book club based around invisible ink. And he wanted me to sort of lead it maybe at the beginning. We had a sort of conversation to that extent, and I sort of was like, no thanks. Because really what I wanted to be is kind of a fly in the wall while other people talked about it. And I would participate, but I didn't want to like keep telling and pointing stuff out to people, because it was pretty obvious at that point that didn't work very well. And if you think about it very clearly, it's just like the idea of demonstrating a story, which is what a story does. It demonstrates what you're talking about. It doesn't tell you. Versus telling. It's showing versus telling. It's the same thing. If I tell people this is what the armature statement of this piece is, and I point out all the things, they're going to be able to see it. But if I put something brand new they've never seen in front of them, can they do the same thing? And in all cases almost, I can't think of a single case actually, especially at the beginning, where people were able to do that. Unless it was like, I can't even think of a single case actually. I was going to say there was one, but I don't think there is. And so in this book club, we started watching Twilight Zone episodes, and it was pretty obvious right from the jump street that the people, even though they knew this was an idea that existed, because we'd talk about it, all of us for the very first meeting were required to read the chapter of Brian's book on armature. Most of the people in that room had heard me talk about this previously and point out other examples. But when we had to watch the opening episode of The Twilight Zone, nobody could decipher it. They could not see what it was about. And The Twilight Zone is very blatant, I would say, in many ways. And certainly the more you learn about armature, the more blatant it is. It seems like when you're writing it, I think, as I've done and make it seems almost too blatant, right? Which we'll get back to in a second. So they could not see it. They could not decipher the story. What we really should have done, which I point out in the cork, is we should have done we should have all written down what we thought it was about without conferring. And then, right? So we had discussion about it, and then we went back through it, and I started to point out some of the things that represent why it was done that way. And once I did, they were like, oh, in a way, a light bulb went on. But it wasn't the light bulb, because the very next week we watched episode 2 and nobody had a clue what that one was about, really. So it just was one of these things where I was like, damn, I thought, like, now that you sort of know all these things are part of something more whole, and it's represented by sort of like a single idea, they'd be able to see it, but they couldn't see it at all. You could see some light bulbs going off in people where they'd be like, oh, like the dialogue is part of, because you're fighting all sorts of preconceived notions. Like a lot of people think a script is just the dialogue, right? Or stuff like that. So you're none of these people thought that, but like I've encountered people thinking that. And then there's it gets more complicated as you sort of try to distill it more, because there's not only the dialogue, there's the subtext of the dialogue. But all of that is part of the armature, if it is in fact armature. So there's like people trying to like get through a lot of the surface things, which is a big problem. A lot of people have trouble with genre, like they like, obviously, like I do, they like certain genres, they don't like other genres, but you gotta be able to cut through that, because genre is not real. It's real from a marketing sense, which is essentially a recommendation based on other things you've seen. Oh, it's like this in a way, but most of it is complete BS, because it doesn't hold up. Like, what is Jaws? Is Jaws a horror movie? Is it an adventure movie? Is it a straight drama? One of the most interesting things you can do in regards to genre, if you really want to see like what, go online to like some of these torrent sites or these like illegal movie downloading sites, and see how they list what the movie is. And you'll see often they have like essentially all the categories. Like Jaws had like 7 or 8 categories it was listed under. It's a thriller, it's a straight drama, it's a adventure, it's, and most of the best movies are kind of like uncategorizable. Right? A lot of people think Star Wars is a science fiction movie, but if it were to fall into any genre, it would be a fantasy, because there's actually no science in Star Wars. So things like this complicate your ability, and all the preconceived notions you bring yourself from your own life, from your own experience with watching movies a long time. And this really goes to show you that simply reading a bunch of stories or watching a bunch of movies does not grant you any real insight into them. You might notice the way people set up certain shots, the cinematography, how they push in on people's faces when it gets emotional, whatever. Sort of these ideas, but it doesn't grant you any sort of real insight into how a story is told if you can't see it. And so this last almost 5 years, I've spent just observing people really having a problem with it. And I wrote Saturday Secrets, which was a free newsletter for a while that you can now purchase. I think there's 40 issues, about 10 pages each. And in there, I used a bunch of examples of like the Twilight Zone, I think, and like Night Gallery, one of Rod Serling's other. I used the movie Rockstar. I used a bunch of different examples that maybe people hadn't seen. And so that's also another resource. This will be kind of more of the same, this cork. Because what I really intend to do with this is sort of twofold. First, force you to do the work. Because the way this cork works is it's going to go on from June 20th, which is Friday. That's when it officially starts. And on Friday, you're going to get the introductory materials and the first chapter and the exercises and resources associated with the first chapter. And then every 3 weeks, to basically the end of the year, the end of 2025, new chapters. Usually, I think the second week you get chapters 2 and 3, and then it's one chapter henceforth every 3 weeks. And then what you do is if you complete the exercises and submit them, you earn additional chapters. A lot of those chapters are appendices, but they're also the last 3 chapters are up for grabs, which are probably the most important chapters in a way, because they really involve a lot of like how to go about getting the resources and stuff outside of the cork. And I've tried to choose things that are you've never seen before, never read before. Because one of the things I've learned about trying to teach or convey armature so that people can see it for themselves is part of the preconceived challenges are people watching stuff previously and having sort of an idea about what it might be, and then they bring those preconceptions and it makes it harder for them to learn. So I've tried to pick things, and we're going to read from plays, short stories, television episodes, and movies. I've tried to include ones that you haven't seen, chances are, so that you're not coming to it with any sort of like preconception of what it, other than maybe you see the the title or whatever, or you've heard about it. Maybe you heard about it once a time or something, but really no attachment to it, which is a problem. And so you're coming in just with a clean slate to try and say, okay, let's go through this and see if I can see what they're trying to actually say. And so the exercises are designed to do that. And then I've included additional things, additional kinds of exercises that don't really pertain to armature per se, or to magic, small m magic per se, but that are exercises which try to get you to think about things in a different way. And also there are some exercises that require you to either get a friend or, you can get it with a stranger too. It doesn't really matter, but sort of outside of reading, viewing, like interacting with people. There are exercises to do with that as well, where you have to get a friend or jot down stuff about conversations you've had in the last 3 weeks, etc. Because as I said in an email recently, the thing that made me a better magician with a capital M had nothing to do really with the magic community. That gets you up to like a baseline, which I would consider like -1, let's say on a scale of all the integers. I guess you to like a -1. You haven't even reached 0 yet. As we know, that's tricksterism. -1 sort of represents tricksterism, let's say. And it wasn't until I went outside that I got up to the 0, 1, 2, 3, let's say, because I started to look around me for how other things were done and what were the important aspects of those things as well. And then it taught me to think about it in a different way, a more important way, a more considerate way. And all of it started to help me, view the world under a different lens. So I wasn't just hitting the surface level things. Immediately my mind would go to the deeper elements. And this just becomes a learned thing. So to go back to my friend, who I initially had that argument with, this is about 2 months ago now, probably, something like that. We had another argument, which was very sort of telling. But this is like 4.5 years hence since, we had that, because we had that book club probably in 2021. So maybe it's like 3 years after the book club, 4.5 years after Secret Gate came out. And we had another argument. Very similar to the first argument, I would say, although he became much more vicious, which I found sort of amusing in a way, but it was sort of telling of like what has happened in those intervening years. And it probably also had to do with maybe things going on in his life at the time. I don't want to attribute everything happening to what, our little kind of argument. He may have had personal stuff going on that day or work issues or whatever. But it was very interesting how it sort of went and where he chose to sort of take the argument. And one of the things so how it started was he wanted me to watch a certain TV show that I had already seen several episodes of. And I had decided that it wasn't really worth my time. Wasn't the worst thing I'd ever seen, but I didn't care about it at all. And I was watching it with my girlfriend, so she felt it was very boring, as did I. Which is, of course, the cardinal sin of making anything is don't be boring. Frank Capra states that in his book, his autobiography, Name Above the Title. That's one of the first things I think it's maybe the opening line. It's like on a single page, I think, maybe, or right above the first chapter. He says, which I'll be paraphrasing, he says, the first rule is don't be boring. And Billy Wilder said the same thing. Another great film director. So, he wanted me to watch. He had texted me about this TV show originally. I said, I already watched it. It's really not for me, but enjoy, kind of thing. And he kind of pushed me a bit, and I was like, no, Krista and I already watched it. We thought it was kind of boring. We watched a couple episodes, and we were like, nah. And we moved on to other things, whatever. If you want to like it, like it. That's up to you. And then we met about 2 weeks later in person for coffee, like tea at night, go for a drink. And he reiterated, you should really watch this, and I said, I started to watch it, didn't interest me, it was boring right from the get-go. And I guess I kind of maybe just dismissed it quickly and then he was like, no, I think it's really, and I probably should have taken, although this isn't my nature per se when it comes to this kind of stuff, been more, well, just tell me about it then. I should have probably just said, hey, well, tell me what you think about it and why, and then maybe you'll convince me. But because I'd already seen it, I was already sort of convinced. So I kind of dismissed it. And then he got angry. And then we started to argue in this coffee shop. Which is not a coffee shop I go to usually. And we kind of argued all the way through the ordering process. And then when we sat down at the table, now this particular coffee shop has doubles as a gaming venue where people play tabletop games. So it was packed with people playing board games. We were one of the few tables where we were just sitting there having, tea. And he started to get he really went hard. He tried to belittle everything about armature that he could, because that's essentially what it boiled down to. I said, what's the armature? What's the armature statement you think represents this particular show? And if you could convince me of that, maybe I'll reconsider. So I'm not infallible. I just don't believe there is one, and I'm not, so tell me. But he got really upset. And he said it was little, and he insulted me in about 15 different ways. Which anyone who knows me doesn't, I don't really take that to, it's more comical. In this context, it's comical, So I continued to push back, but I wasn't I found it funny, more funny than anything, but I wasn't going to just be like, okay. No, I was like, no, you're wrong because this, and you're wrong because this. One of the things he said to me, which was so crazy, he was just losing it, losing his mind, was, you're fixated on this, you're obsessed, it's so little. And I said, well, if William Shakespeare's little, then I guess I'll side with Shakespeare ahead of you. And that sort of calmed him down a bit. Also, and I probably threw a few more on there. I'll side with Steven Spielberg ahead of you, if we're talking about what's little and what's not. And pretty soon it calmed down, because we both sort of calmed down a bit. But it really signaled to me that and as our conversation went forward, he even like contributed to the knocking down of this TV show he thought was so great. You know, he thought there were filler episodes. He thought this thing didn't work. Because I started to say, well, then just tell me about it. Tell me more about it. Because I saw these first couple episodes, but I haven't seen the rest of it. And he denigrated it. And I think more of it had to do with he knew I was right on some level but he was also pissed off that he couldn't tell what the show was about. He sort of had these ideas, and he no doubt related to it, whatever work situation or personal situation in the past or currently, he had related to that, and that's why he liked it. But that doesn't mean it has a meaning. That doesn't mean it's structured properly. That's a whole different. If you like something, you can like something for any reason whatsoever. Is it structured correctly? Is the craft of it done well? Is a separate conversation, and most people think their stuff is 100% overlapping. What they like is also good, and that is not true. That's not true for me. It's not true for anybody. There's things I like that are total crap, from a structural, storytelling, whatever, craft aspect. A good example of this would be Over the Top with Sylvester Stallone. Very strong writing, okay? Sterling Silliphant, who wrote In the Heat of the Night, I believe, was the screenwriter for Over the Top. But the making of the film, the direction, some of the acting, leaves a lot to be desired. And so while the message is still there, because the writing, they have an old saying in a film, which is, if it's not on the page, it's not on the screen. But I mean, that can be destroyed on the way to the screen. And it is a lot of times. There's a lot of great writing that's been destroyed when people try to make it into a movie or whatever. But Over the Top is just kind of, I don't know if it actually was made on a pretty significant budget. So when I sort of looked into that too, it was kind of like, I kind of compared it to other films made that year, and it had a as big or better budget than some of the other films, which turned out pretty good. So in that case, Over the Top is kind of crap. But if you can see past all that, you'll get a good idea that it's the message is still there. Actually, it still resonates, and that's probably one of the reasons why I still think about that movie sometimes. Is though, even though it's like kind of clunky and like doesn't show you a whole lot of conceptually understanding the craft, the message still got to me. So it can actually be pretty bad and still deliver a message. Now, there's plenty of films that I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. There's plenty of films I've seen over the years which don't have any sort of, aren't armature, but I like for various reasons. I think are fine. So that's something we talk about too in the Cork is what you like isn't necessarily good, and understanding the craft. So as my friend got angry about this, it really like tipped me off to the fact that, because one of the things he said was, because eventually we walked back to our cars, and he was still kind of like bitter about the whole thing. And he said that, well, maybe you're wrong, right? And I said, well, anything's possible. I don't think so. And you can't tell me that I'm wrong because you don't understand what you're talking about. You can't decipher this TV show to the point where you can say you're wrong because of this. And here's what it's about, and put all the pieces together. I said, but you're free to like anything. And then he claimed that you needed. He goes, well, maybe you don't have perfect vision or perfect perspective or something. I can't remember how he said it exactly. But here's the thing about armature: you don't need that. You don't need. See, this was his layperson's idea of what was required to see armature. But the result is, once you learn how to see it, it's as blatant as the nose on your face, as this hat. It just jumps out at you. Now, granted, there are stuff where the armature has set out one way and been screwed up in the making of the story. And you'll encounter some of that in this Cork as well, where somebody, and if you've ever read the Lajos Egri book, The Art of Dramatic Writing, which is one of the things you'll have to listen to and read in this cork, he talks about a lot of plays in some section of that book where they started off with one idea and then they tried to change it in the middle and it screwed up the whole thing. He lists them out, actually, and tells you exactly where they were screwed up and why. So that's a good example. That's a great resource. One of the reasons why I included it. So my friend thought you needed some sort of X-ray vision or something in a way, which you don't need, but you need to think about things in a different way. It's not just about the situations that are occurring. It's like why those situations are put in a story. More so than it is the situations themselves. It's like, why would you choose that? Well, you choose that because this is what you're trying to say. And this is not spoiling anything about the cork, but one of the first examples and things you should think about as you're entering this cork, should you take up this challenge, is that a lot of people believe, and I've, through all sorts of writing books, screenwriting books, prose writing, fiction writing books, a lot of people believe that a theme, that an armature, is just another part, like the characters, the plot, the theme. They're wrong. Brian McDonald proved that already. And you should revisit, of course, Brian's book probably this week while you're waiting for the cork to sort of start. You should revisit the fact that a theme can't be a word. A theme can't be kindness, right? An armature can't be kindness. It has to be some angle on kindness. Kindness makes you a better person, whatever. You can look it up on wisesayings.com. Look at all the aphorisms on wisesayings.com under the topic of kindness, and you'll see all the things people have said about kindness. Those are themes, probably. There are some of them probably not. They're just sort of wisecracks or something, but most of those things in there are almost like proverbs that people, quotes from people that you could enact as a armature statement. And the thing that sets Brian above most of the people, and certainly I would say all the people who've written books about this kind of thing, even ahead of Lajos Egri, is that a theme is not one of the other aspects like a plot or dialogue or characters or setting. It is the overarching, it's like the parent to all those things, right? A story doesn't have a theme, like it has characters, it has a plot, it has things. It is a theme. So everything in it in some way represents the theme. Now this can be even counter examples, but that still counts because you're actually countering the theme, let's say, which is really representing it. So it comes, that idea that a story is a theme is the bedrock, the key concept to understanding and being able to see armature. And so we'll get into all that in the cork. We will get into making you watch the first 15 minutes of a film and then try to say what you think this is about and why. Watch a whole film. Say what you say, read this. There's a lot of short stories I put in here. Read this short story. Tell me what's the armature. Give 3 pieces of evidence for for why you believe that. And so that's really what this will be about. Of course, this cork is starting on Friday, the 20th of June, 2025, the 50th anniversary of the day Jaws was released in theaters. If you go onto an Instagram account called The Daily Jaws, or to their website, you'll see that in Martha's Vineyard, they're having all sorts of Jaws-related stuff. In fact, somebody remade a real boat replica of the Orca, and I just saw it this morning. Actually, while I was waiting to live stream here, I saw them driving the boat into the harbor because it's been completed, and it looks just like straight out of the movie. It's really fast. The people that celebrate in this movie is so great. Because the more you dig into this movie, even just the making of it, let alone, that it's armature, it's got a great message, teaches you lots of things and can teach you a lot of things about filmmaking just as one movie. But also the making of it is so ridiculous. It took like way longer than they think. You know, Spielberg thought he was getting fired a bunch of times. Like how they made the shark not working, what they had to do instead. A lot of happy accidents because they were actually really trying to make this movie. And when you try to make stuff, that usually happens a bunch of happy accidents where you discover new ways of doing things that you maybe didn't anticipate. So that's what this is going to be about. So for the next 6 months, essentially, this cork will run this sort of first iteration. I haven't decided if that will be then, you know, how it will stay. Will I then take this whole thing and like turn that into more of a book in the future? I'm not sure. The real reason I did not want to make this into a book, the sort of primary reason that I didn't want to make a second, just a book, just like The Secret Gate was, I wanted to force people to do the work. Because I don't think you're going to be able to learn it if you don't do the work. And then if you don't do the work, you're not going to be a magician with a capital M. It's as simple as that. You have to apply yourself, do the exercises, and there's no reason to be afraid. You're just actually trying to, do I understand this or do I not? And that's what you should be after. When I first started street performing, I told the mentors I had, Eric Evans, Jimmy Talks a Lot, Warpo, I told them to give me the most brutal feedback. To don't sugarcoat it, don't try and protect my feelings or any of that stuff, you know, because I was already 39, so I was like, dispense with all that horse shit. Just, is this bad? Why is it bad? What do you have any ideas on how I can fix it? And then you just do that over and over again until you get better. When I started drawing, you know, I couldn't draw. One of the first pictures I drew was Quint from Jaws, through no coincidence. And then I have, and it's on my Instagram, I think, and then I have a picture I drew of Quint 82 days later. And it's striking, just in the approach, you know, just from 82 days of, which is nothing, you know, 82 days of daily effort though. So it's not nothing in terms of like, I know I had to do it every day, but 82 days is such a short span of time considered. I mean, you've basically spent 4.5 years not really getting this. So why not spend 6 months really trying? Because as you do the exercises and provide the feedback, I'm not, you know, you don't have to like get it right. Oh yeah. So there's the original drawing I had done. And then if I scroll here, I guess, and that's the 82 days later. Thanks to my assistant. So there you go. So why not take 6 months to really put yourself to the challenge? I've tried to space it, you know, 3-week increments feels good. Of course, you don't have to do everything in each 3 weeks. I mean, you can continue as the new ones come out. You can sort of continue to do them in any sort of pattern you want. I am offering additional prizes or bonuses to people who finish it by the end of the year, or to like, it'll probably be the first 2 weeks of January or something, probably, that the sort of official end of it. But that doesn't mean you have to do it then. I mean, you can work at your own pace, or you can try and keep up in real time. That's more or less, that's up to you. But yeah, if 4.5 years of doing it on your own hasn't really granted you the vision to see, this is the answer. Getting down to the brass tacks. I want you to be able to see. And we're going to attempt to really see if you can, until you can. You know, even with this cork ends and you haven't completed, I'll continue to help people, because I'm not concerned so much with like you getting it right. I'm concerned with you doing the work, because I feel like if you do the work, it will come. And then I'll be able to help you, and I'll be able to give you feedback on like why you're not seeing it correctly, or how to think about certain things. I don't want to just point it out to you, as I said before, that doesn't really work very well, but I can help you once you do the exercise. I can help you see where you may have misinterpreted something, for instance, or how you're thinking about something is too narrow, stuff like this. So I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. And yeah, I mean, if I get like 5 or 10 people over the next 6, you know, to do this, that's about all we can expect, I think. If I got 5 people, I'd be really happy, because it's going to be some work, and like people have other stuff going on, and job, family responsibilities. But I think this is like, I've tried to get the amount of work, because you have 3 weeks to sort of do every section, that's plenty of time to like read the things. And I've tried to not give you like too much stuff to consume. And also, like, that's using short stories is great because they can be read, in 20 minutes or less. And so yeah, Friday, as you see along the bottom here, is the way you get involved. It's $25.25. And probably till the end of this first iteration, that will be the price. I'm considering doubling it after that. So probably like early, first of the new year or something. But there's my Venmo account, my PayPal account, send the 25.25, and then I think we already had one person who, on yesterday's debacle of a live stream where I couldn't fix the audio, somebody already raised their hand and sent the money and got involved with the cork. Friday at about 7 p.m., 6:37. I'm going to try and find out when the first Jaws movie was ever shown, and I'm going to launch it officially on that, during that, like you go see movies at 6:30 or 9 or whatever. So at the early one. So thanks a lot for tuning in. If you're watching this now or later, I hope you join us. I hope you try to put this is the real work. A lot of people in books, I read one yesterday, a friend of mine, John Rockerbaumer, who I didn't know exceptionally well, but we, hung out with him many, many times, certainly on his Monday night meetups in Tarrytown, over on the West Bank of New Orleans. And we always had good discussions. John's one of the only people I've ever met in my life where I had preconceived notions of what they'd be like, and he met those. He was exactly like I thought he would be, and then he exceeded them over time the more I got to know him. But John was a fan of, in his work, of saying, like, this is the real work, these techniques and stuff, but that's not the real work. I hate to, John passed away pretty recently, and I'm not trying to run him down at all because he's a friend of mine, but that's not the real work. This is the real work of becoming a magician. It's not the techniques and the tricks and stuff. That stuff is required, but it's not the real work. This is the real work. If you want to be an actual capital M magician, this is what you must do, because otherwise you're going to be a trickster for the rest of your life. And you may be okay with that. People seeing this in the future, you may be okay with that, because it requires work, and you may not be interested in doing any more work than learning a few card tricks or whatever. Oh, I should also say that in this cork, we are going to be learning new tricks. I'm going to be randomly assigning you tricks that I hope you've never done before, and then you're going to be turning those into armature, or a series of those into a show that's armature. So that I should also point that out, because that's probably important to some people. All right. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, about 53 minutes in, I think. Hope you joined the cork. Hope I can help you assist getting your new binoculars or new glasses. And, I just saw a Mark Young thing. Hey, thanks, Mark. Thanks for showing up. And Friday will be where the rubber meets the road. Until then, adieu.